He had 1 bushel from the farmer. Now his whole wheelbarrow was full of money. "Look at that! I certainly did get a good price for that horse," he said to himself when he came back to his own house and dumped all the money in a heap in the middle of the floor. Big Claus will be annoyed when he finally finds out how rich I've become from my only horse. But I'm not going to come right out and tell him about it. Then he sent a boy over to Big Claus to borrow a bushel measure. "I wonder what he wants it for," thought Big Claus, and smeared tar inside the bottom so that a little of whatever was being weighed would stick to it. And it did, because when he got the bushel measure back, there were 3 new silver 8 skilling coins stuck to it. "What's this?" said Big Claus, and ran over to see Little Claus. "Where'd you get all this money?" "Oh, I got it for my horsehide. I sold it last night." "That was certainly a good price," said Big Claus, and he raced back home, picked an axe, and struck every one of his 4 horses on the forehead. Then he skinned them and drove them into town with the hides. "Hides, hides! Who wants to buy hides?" he shouted through the streets. All the shoemakers and tanners came running and asked him how much he wanted. "A bushel of money for each of them," said Big Claus. "Are you crazy? Do you think we have bushels of money?" "Hides, hides! Who wants to buy hides?" he shouted again. But everyone who asked how much the hides cost, he replied, "A bushel of money." "He's trying to make a fool of us," they all said. Then the shoemakers picked up their straps and the tanners their leather aprons, and they all started beating Big Claus. "Hides, hides!" they jeered at him. "Oh yes, we'll give you a hide that bleeds like a pig. Now get out of town," they shouted, and Big Claus had to rush off as fast as he could. He had never been so badly beaten in his life. "Well," he said when he had gotten home, "Little Claus is going to pay for this. I'm going to murder him for this." But back at Little Claus's house, his grandmother had just died. Now, it's true she'd been terribly ill-tempered and mean towards him, but even so he was quite sad. He took the dead woman and put her in his warm bed to see whether she might come back to life. There she would lie all night while he slept in the corner, sitting on a chair. That was something he had done before. As he was sitting there all night, the door opened and Big Claus came in with an axe. He knew where Little Claus's bed stood, and he went right over and struck the dead grandmother on the forehead, thinking it was Little Claus. "Take that," he said. "Now you won't make a fool of me any more." And then he went back home. "What a mean and evil man," said Little Claus. "He wanted to murder me, but it's a good thing the old lady was already dead, or it would have taken her life." Then he dressed like his old grandmother in her Sunday best, borrowed a horse from his neighbor, and harnessed it to his wagon, and put his old grandmother on the back seat so she wouldn't fall out when he was started driving. Then they headed off through the woods, and when the sun came up, they were outside a big inn, where Little Claus stopped, and went inside to get a bite to eat. The innkeeper was very, very rich, and he was also a good man, but hot-tempered, as if there were pepper and tobacco inside of him. "Good morning," he said to Little Claus. "You've put on your fine clothes awfully early today." "Yes," said Little Claus. "I'm going to town with my old grandmother. She's sitting outside in the wagon, but I can't get her to come indoors. Would you mind taking her a glass of mead? But you'll have to speak up because she doesn't hear very well." "Why, certainly," said the innkeeper. He poured a big glass of mead and took it outside to the dead grandmother, who was propped up in the wagon. "Here's a glass of mead from your grandson," said the innkeeper, but the dead woman didn't say a word. Just sat there without moving. "Didn't you hear me?" shouted the innkeeper, as loud as he could. "Here's a glass of mead from your grandson." Once again he shouted the same thing, and then one more time. But she didn't budge in the slightest. He got angry and tossed the glass of mead right in her face, so it ran down her nose. and she toppled over backward into the wagon, because she had been merely propped up, but wasn't tied down. "What's this?" shouted Little Claus as he came running out the door and grabbed the innkeeper by the shirt front. "You've gone and killed my grandmother. Just take a look at that big hole in her forehead." "Oh, what bad luck!" cried the innkeeper, wringing his hands. "It's all the fault of my bad temper. Dear Little Claus, I'll give you a whole bushel of money to pay for your grandmother's burial if she were my own. But don't say a word, or they'll chop off my head, and that would be awful." So Little Claus got a whole bushel of money, and the innkeeper buried the grandmother as if she were his own. As soon as Little Claus got back home with all the money, he once sent his boy over to see Big Claus to ask if he could borrow the bushel measure. "What's this?" said Big Claus. "I thought I killed him. I'm going to have to see this for myself." And so he took the bushel measure over to Little Claus in person. "Where on earth did you get all that money?" he asked, opening his eyes wide when he saw how much more Little Claus had accumulated. "It was my grandmother, not for me, that you killed," said Little Claus. "But now I've sold her for a bushel of money." "That was certainly a good price," said Big Claus as he rushed home, picked up an axe, and promptly killed his old grandmother. He put her in his wagon and drove into town to the apothecary shop. "Who is it, and where did you get it?" asked the apothecary. "It's my grandmother," said Big Claus. "I've killed her for a bushel of money." "Good Lord," said the apothecary. "You don't know what you're saying. Don't say things like that, or you could lose your head." And then he told him exactly what a dreadful, evil thing he had done, and what a bad person he was, and he ought to be punished. Big Claus was so scared that he had leapt straight from the apothecary's shop into his wagon, cracked his whip at the horses, and raced off home. The apothecary and everyone else thought he was mad, so they let him go where he liked. "You're going to pay for this," said Big Claus, when he was out on the road. "Oh yes, you're going to pay for this, Little Claus." As soon as he got home, he took the biggest sack he could find and went over to Little Claus and said, "You've made a fool of me again. First I killed my horses, then my old grandmother. It's all your fault, but you're never going to trick me again." And he grabbed Little Claus around the waist and stuffed him into a sack. Then he slung him over his back and shouted, "Now I'm going to take you out and drown you." It was a long walk to reach the river, and Little Claus wasn't easy to carry. The road passed very close to the church, where the organ was playing, and people were singing so beautifully inside. When Big Claus put down the sack, holding Little Claus right next to the church door, thinking that it might do him some good to go inside and listen to the hymn first, before continuing on his way, Little Claus couldn't get out, and everyone else was in the church, so Big Claus went inside. "Oh me, oh my," sighed Little Claus from inside the sack. He twisted and turned, but it was impossible for him to loosen the cord. At the moment, an old cattle driver with chalk-white hair and a big walking stick in his hand came by. He was driving a big herd of cows and bulls in front of him. They trampled over the sack that Claus was in, tumbling it to the side. "Oh my," sighed Little Claus. "I'm so young, but I'm already headed for heaven. And what a poor man I am," said the cattle driver. "Here I am so old, but it is not yet my time to go." "Open the sack," shouted Little Claus. "Climb in and take my place. You'll end up in heaven at once." "Oh, I'd like that very much," said the cattle driver, untying the sack, and Little Claus jumped right out. "Could you take care of the cattle?" said the old man, and he climbed into the bag, which Little Claus tied up, and then went on his way, taking along the cows and bulls. A little while later, Claus came out of the church and hoisted the sack into his back, thinking that it certainly was a lot lighter, because The old cattle driver was no more than half the weight of Little Claus. How easy it is to carry him now. Well, that's probably because I've been listening to him. He went over to the river, which was deep and wide, threw the sack with the old cattle driver into the water, and shouted after him, thinking he was Little Claus, "Take that! Now you won't be making a fool of me any more." And then he headed home. When he came to the crossroad, he met Little Claus walking along with all of his cattle. "What's this?" said Big Claus. "Didn't I drown you?" "Yes, you did," said Little Claus. "You threw me into the river less than half an hour ago." "But where did you get all these wonderful cattle?" asked Big Claus. "They're sea cattle," said Little Claus. "Let me tell you a whole story. And by the way, thanks for drowning me, because now I'm back on my feet, and let me tell you, I'm as rich as can be. I was so scared when I was inside that sack, and the wind whistled in my ears when you threw me off the bridge and into the cold water. I sank straight to the bottom, but I didn't hurt myself because the loveliest, soft grass grows down there. That's where I landed, and the bag was opened at once. The loveliest maiden, wearing chalk-white clothing, and with green wreath around her wet hair, took my hand and said, 'Is that you, Little Claus? Well, first let me give you these cattle. 5 miles up the road there's another whole herd that I want you to have.' And then I saw that the river was a great highway for the sea fleet. Down at the bottom, they were walking and driving all the way from the sea toward the land, to the place where the river ends. It was so lovely with the flowers and the freshness of the grass, and fish swimming in the water. They flitted around my ears like birds in the air. How handsome the people were, and how many cattle there were, ambling along the ditches and fences. "But why did you come back to us so soon?" asked Big Claus. "That's not what I would have done if it was so charming down there." "Well, you see," said Little Claus, "it was very cunning of me. You heard me say that the mermaid told me that 5 miles up the road, and by the road she meant the river. Of course, since she can't travel any other way, there's a whole herd of cattle waiting for me. I happen to know where the river starts to bend. First one way, then the other, making a whole detour. It's much shorter, if you can do it, to come up here on land and head straight across the river. That way I saved almost 2.5 miles and reached my sea cattle much quicker." "Oh, you certainly are a lucky man," said Big Claus. "Do you think I could get some sea cattle too if I went down to the bottom of the river?" "Oh yes, I imagine so," said Little Claus. "But I can't carry you in a sack to the river. You're much too heavy for me. But if you walk there yourself, then climb into the bag, I'd be more than happy to throw you in." "Thanks so much," said Big Claus. "But if I don't get any sea cattle when I get there, I'm going to give you a beating. Believe you me." "Oh no, don't be so mean." And then they went down to the river. The cattle were so thirsty that when they saw the water, they ran as fast as they could down the slope to drink. "Look how fast they're moving," said Little Claus. "They're longing to go down to the bottom." "Yes, but help me first," said Big Claus. "Otherwise, I'll give you a beating." And then he climbed into the big sack that was lying across the back of one of the bowls. "Put a rock inside, because otherwise I'm afraid I won't sink," said Big Claus. "Oh, I'm sure you will," said Little Claus. But just the same, he put a big rock in the sack and tied the cord tight, then gave it a shove. Plop! Big Claus landed in the river and promptly sank to the bottom. "I'm afraid he's not going to find any cattle," said Little Claus, and then he headed home with all he had.